I've got two things to make sure that we keep you on your toes and paying attention. Firstly, and most importantly, we brought our 10-month-old son, and he is in the third row in the audience, and he is not, and he's not a very quiet kid. So occasionally you might hear him. So that's element one. And then secondly, we also this is another element, unplanned. Secondly is the resolution of the slide seems to be complex with the system here, with the projector. So, the images don't all look as slick. So it's going to be about the content, unfortunately, not the imagery. Systems change and the city, that's what I wanted to talk about, and hopefully we can discuss it together, because I think it's important that we talk about this topic. And just to tell you who I am, I work with a practice called 00, which is an architecture, design and strategy practice based in London that has the tendency to spin out all sorts of things and teams. So this gives you an overview. We co-developed and run collaborative workspaces, part of the Impact Hub network. These are two of them in London. Two colleagues of mine started WikiHouse. Some of you may know it as an open hardware project. And other colleagues started Open Desk, a platform where young designers and fabricators can meet each other to cut out the large-scale furniture industry from things like desks. And also we do a lot of research. And some of you may know this book. It's a compendium for the civic economy, which we wrote 5-6 years ago. And a lot of what I'll be talking about starts with this, really. Because, of course, 5-6 years ago, we were talking 2010, in the middle of the crisis, and lots of people, not just us, but lots of people were thinking about new ways of conceiving of urban change, given the crisis and all that it revealed about our broken systems, right? So we wrote that book asking the question that many people ask themselves. I'm going through this first bit quite quickly because I think it's fairly familiar territory now, where from large-scale public and private finance we had to move to massive, collaborative, small-scale, citizen-driven change, working together with other actors from public and private sector. So we defined the civic economy as the values and aims of civic society meeting new forms of entrepreneurship, informed by lean startup, tactical urbanism, all those kind of things that we were also talking about in the morning. And of course, the big cultural sweep that this is part of is that where the 20th century was all about democratization of consumption, the 21st century hopefully can be about the democratization of production and all that it will unlock in terms of building a more sustainable and frankly also more fun future. So in the Compendium for the Civic Economy, we looked at a series of great things that citizens and citizen entrepreneurs are doing that at that point in time, 2010, could inspire disillusioned change makers as well as architects, as policymakers, etc. And the point, of course, is, and we all know this, I mean, this is a slide that was perhaps more interesting 5 years ago than it is now. The point is it's real, right? We know it's real. We know that this different way of creating cities is happening, and it is, more importantly, not just happening, but also generating real outcomes. Just to give you a couple of examples, I won't go into these in a lot of detail. I've skipped the first one, because that is actually taught more, and I will talk about that more. But people reinventing libraries, because libraries seem to have lost not just their funding, but also their purpose. People not expecting the state to come up with sustainable energy solutions, but doing it for themselves in agile negotiations with wind farm developers. That's a small Scottish village that basically, out of a planning negotiation, got its own wind turbine, which enabled it to make all the homes in the village energy efficient, which saved them £600 per year per household in heating oil because it wasn't on the gas net, let alone did it have any sustainable energy. Projects like Granny's Finest in Rotterdam, which is beautiful and phenomenal, which all grew out of the moment where a young fashion designer saw his girlfriend's grandmother sitting in an older people's home, knitting on her own and being quite depressed, and realized that there's all these young fashion designers out there who know how to make great designs but can't actually quite knit as well as the older generation. And there's all these people in the older generation who can do phenomenal things but don't have anywhere to unlock these skills and instead spend their time being depressed, lonely, not feeling valued, and also, in a kind of perverse way, really expensive to us all, right? Because they're so lonely and depressed. And so the point is that these new forms of entrepreneurship, in this case, of course, Granny's Finest brings young designers together with older generation, and they knit and they exchange skills and they exchange ideas and they're part of a very active, vital community. The point is that all these left field initiatives, these strange, weird and wonderful, unexpected, perhaps marginal seeming, exotic seeming, irrelevant seeming forms of citizen entrepreneurship, they're real, but they're generating the type of outcomes, social outcomes, environmental outcomes, that the public sector and the private sector, as we know it, have found really hard to achieve, right? Renewable energy, better lives for older people, new learning exchange mechanisms instead of our old and stale libraries, right? These are all things that, that are highly relevant and that, for some reason, citizen entrepreneurship is more effective at, in many cases, achieving. So in the UK, politicians, of course, took hold of this agenda, branded it the big society, but actually, and in the Netherlands with the participatiemaatschappij, it's the same thing, but I think it goes much, much further than that. It's a genuinely new participation culture, and it has the potential to create a genuinely different economy, right? And that's the point. So we have the potential of going from an economy led by the few, an old school corporate economy, to an economy that's led by the many, and that is profound, right? So, but let's talk a little bit more about Todmorden, because I just want to get one message across. Todmorden is interesting because it was two ladies 8 years ago starting to basically grow fruit and vegetables in public space, not asking anyone for permission, not asking whether this was okay. They just got started. And they got started because they actually wanted to create change in an environmental sustainability direction, but no one was listening to them. In this small, depressed, post-industrial city, people had other things to do. They weren't interested in sustainability, but they were interested in food, and they were interested in doing things together. So they started. Lots of people started to participate. People are curious. People were wondering what was going on. And this incredible edible idea was one big invite. Just take part. Do it in your own street. Do it on the nearby square. And all of a sudden they created a movement. Over there, you have the health center taking part. The police station, there's corn growing in front of the police station. There are fruit trees at the railway station. All the housing associations take part. All the schools are taking part. And all of a sudden, you're seeing that fewer young people leave this once depressed small town. There's more startups. There are things going on that the economic development department of the local city council would have loved to achieve but hadn't for 20 years. And all of a sudden, there's this gradual shift happening, right? So this is profound. Two ladies doing something that seems marginal and weird and anarchistic, which has profound and relevant and powerful outcomes. So I've got 3 questions, and this is the first one that I'd like to discuss with you, which is, if we like this kind of stuff, if we think it's generating real outcomes, how to accelerate it, right? How to accelerate the opportunities for citizens en masse to take part in this micro-massive collaborative future and start the projects that they feel strongly about. Because we know there's always inequality in opportunities for people to initiate and take part in those projects, right? The big terrible thing that I'm hearing often in the Netherlands, actually, is this sense where people from civil servants say, well, but this is all about citizens doing it for themselves. So if they're not doing it for themselves, that's their own problem, and we can't help them. I disagree. I think that we can enable more people to take part in this future and therefore generate the type of outcomes that they feel strongly about. So we need to address that inequality. And so I think the potential to initiate stuff, whatever it may be, through targeted platform approaches, and that sounds like a lot of rhetoric, but I'll explain what I mean, is relevant. Very few cities, I think the challenge is, very few cities understand this as a systemic opportunity. There are some cities, and yesterday I was in a room with people from Bologna, where they're really taking this to heart and they're looking at this citizen-driven city from a very systemic perspective. So there's some good examples, and in Rotterdam also, I think in some areas there's some real critical mass in the opportunities that people have to be entrepreneurial for the benefit of their cities. So one example, do you see that? Oh, there we go. It was the Wheel of Doom, wasn't it? But we're back. So one example of how you can tangibly accelerate this is in this humble shop on a South London high street. And it was a project called The Open Works, started by a remarkable team of people called Tessie Britton and Laura Billings, with whom I collaborated. And they created a very tangible one-stop shop where anyone who might have an idea or who could have an idea but doesn't yet could wander in, driven by people's natural curiosity, invited for a cup of tea, talk about the area, not just about, lack of car parking and dog poo, but being inspired by lots of examples that they had gathered in that space of people creating their own city in different ways. And the aim of the team was to, within 3 or 4 weeks, turn a potential idea that someone might have into a live project, right? To really maximize the potential of citizens to be active in the public domain and be entrepreneurial. And they had a very, this really doesn't work with the resolution, but it doesn't matter. They had a very specific approach to go from that shop front to a team to support people, to connecting them to networks, to other people in the area that might be interested in doing similar things, giving them reassurance around things like insurance and safety concerns, which they kind of arranged at a collective level. Sometimes they worked with micro budgets, like a few £100 perhaps, but much more importantly, they gave them design support, enabled them to make a website and really go live quickly and turn a loosely held idea into a live project with potential impact. So loads and loads of projects came out. Well, that was the experiment, right? If you build it, will they come? The old cliche, it's always an important question. So they built it for a year, and indeed, people came. Lots of projects came out. Cooking, so batch cooking, collective cooking, an underused community kitchen. Co-working in a series of cafes on the high street. A collective shop for craftspeople, rock, paper, scissors, where instead of having to rent their own space, they could together put their stuff to the market. Streets being closed off for play, orchards being planted, etc., etc. A peer-to-peer learning initiative called Trade School. And what people say is that this really has an impact on how they feel about the area. They say, this is different. It's not charity. This is real people working together to shape a future together in a different way. And of course, I'm a geographer by origin, so I love this. It's like creating your own little Silicon Valley, people said. But that is profound, because the point is, why is Silicon Valley powerful for entrepreneurs? It's because there's dense, overlapping networks that make it possible to turn weird ideas into real, tangible possibilities, and where you can get validation on your idea, peer-to-peer support, yes, finance, but most of all, the encouragement that stuff is possible, right? So this became that kind of accelerator platform for lots of civic initiative, and it shows that it's possible. But now let's step back a bit. If we like this so much, how to understand this, right? What's really going on here? And I'm always reminded of something that Kieran Kirkland, a colleague from the Nominate Trust, says, let's talk about the impact duck, because way too often we focus on what we see above the surface of the water, right? We see that duck going wonderfully speedy in that direction, but what we don't understand is actually what's pedaling underneath, that messy reality of what's happening that enables this forward movement, right? So let's try and understand what's really going on here. And one of the things that there's a lot going on, but I think we're at risk here every time we talk about the cool stuff that citizens do of understanding the wrong thing. And I've been saying this for years now. The problem is that politicians and policymakers and us all, we love to visit and applaud and learn from the individual startup examples. And then we start thinking about urban change as being driven entirely by this civic startup movement, a bit like tech startups, right? We all love the lean startup logic of go live quickly, test, learn, iterate, etc. We love a startup. In fact, it seems that all we can talk about is a startup, but this is not about startups. This is about a much messier reality. This is about interlocking systems. This happens to be done by the Academy for System Change in Boston, and it shows, this messy diagram shows how fish stocks and the health of the fish stock in an area is ultimately impacted on by a range of factors, including things like gang violence. Why? Because gang violence in a neighborhood impacts on the levels of trust between people, which make certain social contracts around what you do and don't do as a fisherman harder to enforce. Right? So social norms are impacted on by things like gang violence or socioeconomic realities, and that impact on our ability to govern the commons, what we have in common, the public domain together, and undertake new projects together and create things that are of benefit to all of us. It's a messy reality. And thinking about urban change as a bunch of startups impacting on social outcomes and impacting on public space is just too simple. So actually we're talking about something different here, and Todmorden is an example of actually, Incredible Edible is not a startup. It's an intervention in a system that enables a whole lot of different startup ideas to flourish. But at the end of the day, it's a systemic change, not just one weird and wonderful idea. We find complexity difficult. Elinor Ostrom, economics Nobel Prize winner, said this, and she's right on. In the mid-20th century, the dominant effort of us all was to reduce complexity into simple models, right? And criticize anything in terms of governance that didn't fit that simplistic model. State, market, privatization, those kind of things. And this is Elinor Ostrom, and I think she is absolutely crucial to this debate. She writes about the commons. And the point is, she did an enormous amount of research showing that the simplistic way of thinking about urban change or change in general and governance in general didn't do any justice to the reality of how things really work. So it turns out that complex communities of people, communalities of people and collectivities of people are very well able to govern places and to govern fish stocks and to take care of the future that we desire. They might just be as effective, she found, as the state or as the market in generating outcomes, right? So she did the research, and she comes to the conclusion that a core goal of public policy should be the development of a new generation of institutions to genuinely bring out the best in humans. And so we shouldn't talk about startups anymore, but we should think about the next generation of 21st century institutions that can sustain a wide range of future startups, civic initiatives, community initiatives, etc. Right? So let's see something weird and wonderful like Todmorden as a new type of institution that can bring forth a whole range of new powerful ideas, as opposed to seeing it through the lens of startups. So then she goes on and she talks about polycentric institutions and how they help or hinder innovativeness, learning, adapting, etc. Right? That's, I think, what the collective debate needs to be about. There's other people who say a similar thing. Mark Ventresca from Oxford University, he also talks, don't be an entrepreneur, be a systems change agent, right? The image of the entrepreneur is the wrong imagery. It scares lots of people out there, the citizens, who don't necessarily recognize themselves into that. And we learn the wrong lessons. We don't get the sense of the task. And he says, well, because what really happens when change occurs, right? We're recombining existing elements. We're mobilizing networks. We're mobilizing resources. We're changing behavior. We're changing values. We're doing a lot of things that are more complex than entrepreneurship seems to suggest. And if we want to move beyond what Gramsci famously called the sort of morbid moment where the old is dying but the new struggles to be born, we need to think about our language. 10 minutes, great. And an example he gives is electricity, the way we know it, Edison and things. That was, of course, 19th century large-scale urban change. But notice that every country has its own very different energy system. The United States and Europe and different countries within Europe, certainly back in the day. If it was just about entrepreneurship, that wouldn't have happened. But the point is that the people who were entrepreneurial at that moment, they were system builders. They didn't just create companies, although we remember the companies, but they created new coalitions, new regulations, new protocols, new finance models. So they actually shifted a system as opposed to just founding companies and initiatives. And that's the thing that we need to discuss. So if we like it, how do we invest in it? Because this is no longer about funding just startups, is it? Funding startups is hard enough. But if it's about systems change, then how do we invest in that? And I think there is that real question that there's always desire out there for people to invest in new things, and there's a need for investment. But where do the two meet? There's a whole range of different kind of funding models out there, from grant funding through to the crowd, of course. And there's enormous amounts of initiatives. In the UK, you have Big Society Capital. In the Netherlands, you have Stichting Doen, etc. And often they're finding that there's huge numbers. This is just a slide about big numbers. Don't read it. It's just big numbers, right? There's massive amounts of capital waiting to be invested in good things, right? In impactful good things. But a lot of investors are finding too few social enterprises initiatives to be investable. And that's why there's actually still a lack of money in a sector where we'd like to see it happen more, right? That's why too many social enterprises, civic initiatives, co-ops are not getting the investment they deserve. So something will have to change. Right? The money is not the problem. It's the tactics through which we hope that investment will take place. And that's about understanding really what's the point of investment. There's so many different business models that civic initiatives might need, right? Citizen-driven change isn't all about revenue-driven little businesses, right? Incredible Edible Todmorden is only just incorporated as a loose association because there were people who wanted to donate money to them. They never saw themselves as a business. So the idea that everything needs to become a business with a revenue model and go down that kind of cool entrepreneurial route is simply just not true. What it is about outcomes, right? And we're starting to understand outcomes. Just like in the case of Granny's Finest, where we know that people who are old and depressed and lonely, that's not just human tragedy, it's also very expensive to the taxpayer, right? And these calculations are now becoming more and more common. We now know what it costs to take a child into care. We now know what it costs when families break down. We know what it costs when ex-prisoners commit crimes again. So we can start to calculate how this works. And you get very complex financial constructions around these outcomes. This is a social impact bond scheme, which actually shows how, because we know what the societal costs are of prisoners reoffending, we can invest in a program that stops reoffending. We can get private investors to do that even, and the government pays them only if the program is successful, right? So we're starting to think about very complex financial toolboxes to start generating impact from an understanding of societal cost. So there's all these people going down that road, but does that model of very calculated, very strict theories of change really work for citizen-driven, open-ended, collaborative, messy, unpredictable, must not instrumentalize because if you do so, people will actually just switch off again and be cynical kind of initiatives? I don't think so. So we still lack the tools. A lot of us, and the Netherlands is a neophile country. We love something shiny and new, don't we? So we love social impact bonds. But does that really work for this massively collaborative, citizen-driven future? I don't think so. Does, social physics, the brave new world of big data, where everything can be measured and calculated, and where behavior change can be tracked via mobile devices in the most intricate matters, does that really work for citizens? Is that, even if we believe that we need to fund outcomes, even if we believe that we need to invest in these businesses, not on the basis of them making money every week, but on the basis of the value they create for society, should we really expect them to measure every last bit of impact and change they create? This, I think, is the real conundrum. We don't yet know how to do it. Because back to Topmorden, right? They know they've had an impact, but they've never been able to measure it. They've never been able to be clear about it. But what they have got is lots of citizens absolutely supporting what's going on there. So I think we need to start, and I'm going to go through this quickly, we need to really start looking at what are the ways are in which we can invest. So if it's true that we can build these platforms like the Open Works that create all these outcomes like health and well-being, learning through a series of complex steps, we can start to create perhaps finance for the platform in a different way and bring together a coalition of people, ultimately whose wallet will be hit when society breaks down. So can you bring foundations, local government, philanthropy, and corporate social responsibility together to fund these very open-ended platforms without requiring them to track down every bit of impact we have? This is an open question for me, right? I'm not necessarily providing the answers here, but it is a question that needs asking. One way, and this is towards the end now of my talk, one way in which the Impact Hub in Birmingham is doing this in an interesting way is that they said, well, we raised money through Kickstarter, £65,000, which is more than 4 times the amount that was previously raised in Birmingham through Kickstarter. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people funded them, some of them giving a £5, some of them giving 5K. But interestingly, they say, rather than communicating our impact to funders or to the public sector, we can be held accountable for what we do to all these funders, to the citizens of Birmingham, right? We just need to become an open organization that communicates openly and transparently and builds legitimacy and builds accountability to our everyday action, not through the abstract big data, but through our everyday conversation with all our members and the people who contributed in us. So there are different ways of doing that. That's some Dutch that's skipped in there. So basically they're saying we need to see ourselves almost like a new town hall where we bring together systems financing, not just startup finance, not just accelerator programs for a bunch of startups that might or might not make money. We need to create finance for these systemic interventions. We need to create legitimate spaces that genuinely lower the thresholds for people to take part, like that Open Works, where tea was always bubbling, right? Inviting people in, and therefore creating new legitimacy, right? Not through the ballot box, but through everyday interaction. And we need to see ourselves as a curator and an instigator of a movement for change, so that ultimately we can become a new type of town hall, not an abstract democratic one, but a lived one that accepts that messy, complex reality of how change really happens. Now, and yesterday we heard that Amsterdam is going to be one of the next fab cities, right? Part of that global movement that takes the open-making culture from startups to strategic city policy, right? I think that's great. Yeah. I think it's good to talk about open source principles, not just at the level of stuff, huh? Cool chairs or cool little widgets, but actually at the level of how can we make a city be completely circular in its economy. I think that's fantastic. So that's a big strategic move, but how do we prevent the Fab City concept from being the next smart city, the next sustainable city, the next kind of rhetorical brand that ultimately citizens not just suspect, but actually recognize isn't being generated with them? How do we really create participative town halls for change? So if Fab City and if the various Fab Labs that are being created across Amsterdam and other cities can genuinely become these little mini platforms that can spur the creativity of citizens to be entrepreneurial at whatever level they're at, right? At high tech, low tech, pedestrian, the banal, whatever it is that people feel strongly about, if we can genuinely create that opportunity, then we're creating a fab city. So we're now experimenting with that around the issue of childcare in Birmingham, really trying to convene a very wide movement of actors to change the childcare system, because we know that that's a systems issue. It's not about two new startups that provide some sort of funky tech solution to finding your childminder more easily. Right? That's not the systemic challenge. It's that all around childcare is broken in the UK. So it's a systems challenge that requires a systems response, not a startup response. So last slide. If the 21st century will be, and I think it will be, defined by new models of distributed city making, distributed change making, where we require micro-massive collaboration, right? Where the micro actions of two ladies in Totmorden can have massive impact at a town scale, at a city scale, at a regional scale. And if that's going to happen at a scale as yet unwitnessed, because frankly, we know that it's required, the public sector isn't going to do it for us, we don't trust the private sector to do it for us on its own, but we need all of them in the room and be part of that collaborative future. If that's what we want, and I think that's where we're going, then we must focus on developing that new institutional infrastructure that enables us to bring out the best in humans, right? Like Eleanor Ostrom said. That is the challenge. And that's a technical challenge. So that all of a sudden, we then have to focus on things from new ways of convening movements. How do we actually do that? How would we turn Fab City into a movement, not just a brand or a badge in Amsterdam? Across the public, private, and citizen sector, absolutely. We must focus on new ways of generating a shared language around these different futures, right? Because frankly, lots of people in Amsterdam won't get it if we keep on using the lingo of Fab City. New collaboration tools that enable people from different backgrounds actually to do stuff together. And that's messy and it's complex, and it's not just about tech, right? It's also about just hosting a conversation well. New data infrastructure, new ways of actually enabling that collective accountability, shared legitimacy for non-necessarily democratically elected forms of change. Systems-focused finance that understands that the complexity is actually in the system, not just at the level of the startup, etc. Those are the real challenges, what we call the dark matter of changing our cities. Not as funky as the startup stories, and we need those stories to remain inspired and energetic, right? But we also need to really hone in on what is the stuff, the dark matter stuff that sits underneath that actually enables this future to come into being. And hopefully we can talk about that more this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Please.
Here go? Okay.
As a young father, I really understand your interest in new options for childcare.
Indeed.
Well, there must be a personal interest in this subject here.
There always is, you know.
Of course, that's where it starts.
Indeed.
But is childcare one of the new institutions that you're talking about? What is an institution? When you say, what are the next generation of 21st century institutions? What is an institution in this context?
Absolutely. An institution is not something that has a fence around it and a building. And that's how we've come to think of institutions, as buildings, as fixed organizations with a name. Right? Institutions is the stuff that enables us to work together, to keep working together in the long term. It's the governance of things. It's the culture around a certain topic. So around childcare, the problem is that we have a lot of institutions. We've got creches that in the UK all are underfunded and overstretched. That's a failed institution. The point is we need to recreate the social contract around childcare, where actually it might be okay to do in childcare more formally at neighborhood level without there being all these costly accreditation structures. That would be a different institution, right? Looking at the regulation of it. That would be an important aspect of it. Looking at the financing for it as well. That is part of the institution. So when I talk about institutions, I don't talk about the next new large organizations. I'm talking about the messy kind of social contracts that enable us to do stuff together in the long run. And that's, I think, perhaps worth saying. My big worry is that citizen initiatives are really vulnerable. Right? They burn on lots of initial energy, and they don't necessarily are always able to make the next step. So we don't like the word institutions, but for them to persevere, to be sustainable in the long term, we need to think about what their next steps are in becoming institutions like the way we'd like them to be, right? 21st century, open, dynamic, collaborative institutions.
Meanwhile, there's this little guy out here waving at you.
Indeed, indeed.
He's been exiled for screaming, but
I
he'll
know.
be back.
This is always going to happen, right? But hey, I'm happy that he's here anyway.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Joost Beunderman, thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.